My name is Paul Schnell. I'm the Chief of Police for the city of Maplewood, Minnesota. I've been involved with and worked with SARTs for a long, long time. Going back to my early days as an officer in a community when one of the first SARTs in Minnesota. And it was a remarkable experience. I think it was an opportunity for us, first time for me as an officer and somebody who worked with this really remarkable group of people to come together and talk about the ways we could do that better. Not that it was always easy, but it was nonetheless really incredible experience. Since that time, I've had the chance to provide and work on a number of different task forces and groups around SARTs and building teams. And now, as a chief, I've had the role more on the administrative level of encouraging our ongoing deep participation as members of a team. Well, I think first and foremost, one of the key benefits of a SART is the fact that we ultimately provide better services to the people who need it. In this case, victims. And I think everybody in the system wants that. We want to provide the best. I truly believe that that's what we're all about. And at the same time, I think one of the key benefits, though all of the roles that we play are really important to both the victim as well as to the outcomes, whatever that may be, the reality is the services that I provided as an investigator, as a cop, were better because of the relationships I had with other people who were doing the work. And I think that's the thing that can't be underestimated, that the relationships actually produce better outcomes in me as a practitioner, in our team as practitioners. And ultimately, we ended up really having better understandings of what it was going to take to move cases forward for prosecution. We understood more clearly the fact that making sure that victims had support through advocacy was key and critical to the investigative outcomes that we sought. So the benefits were all over the place. But oftentimes, when we look at these things through the lens of our own discipline, we can forget that we are one component, all important, in a really critical series of people who provide the services necessary to achieve justice, whatever that looks like, prosecution or not. We have to remember, at the end of the day, the business and the work of these teams is really about applying pressure and support. I mean, we want the very best. Law enforcement, from a law enforcement standpoint, we want the best in terms of the services we provide. And it is the obligation of both me as a leader as well as our team to hold that up, to say this is what we want. And at the same time, it is the obligation of the team to make sure that there is necessary and ample support to ensure that can happen. So we have to really balance, I think, high levels of pressure and high levels of support. And when that happens, most of us, those are the people that we admire in our lives, the people who held us to a higher standard and yet would have gone to the wall to help us succeed. And that's what teams do. They push us and they support us. And that's what I've loved about being a member. There's no doubt that the larger the group that we can bring together, oftentimes the better some of the outcomes can be, but even more importantly than that, the more broad our thinking becomes about the services and work we provide, especially when we think about services to communities of color and historically underserved populations. Really having presence and being intentional about that, even if we don't have high numbers of cases, is really important to this process. We know that groups as a whole generally become quite normative, but that's why we need to make sure that we are reaching out to the boundaries of that and making sure that the voices, the interests, the needs of different communities, whether that's academic, as I said earlier, communities of color, underserved populations, we need to make sure that they're there. Our high schools, our middle schools. I mean, these entities, these organizations are all important. And oftentimes they are a secondary or an afterthought, but they can really help inform the work. And I think it's beneficial for us to engage them as much as possible. So I think the way some of the teams I've been involved in that have done that is there may have been representatives, a small subcommittee perhaps of the team that went out and met with representatives or a person and got input and provided a briefing, so to speak, about the work of the team, more globally, more broadly, what the focus was. And we can't underestimate the importance of just that action. The fact that we took the time to reach out, the fact that we took the time to go to them and talk to them about what the team's involved in and get input as to the types of things that affected community felt would be important, or the ways that they might assist or help. We can't underestimate that. But we have to be explicit, we have to be intentional, and I think it becomes important that the team really look at who sits around that table, who is going to be most effective at reaching out. It may not be law enforcement, but it may be. It may be advocacy, it may be the medical folks, it may be prosecution, but finding who that's going to be to reach out and make those connections, that's important. When we look at why SARTs perhaps kind of really where it kind of came from, and I don't care what community you're in, big, small, where you have specialized units or not, or generalist kind of practitioners. The reality is when you look at these cases around our country, the outcomes have oftentimes been profoundly dismal. I mean, the outcomes are incredibly dismal. And when I look at that, when we think about that, I think all of us who do this work really need to think about the ways in which we need to achieve better outcomes. And oftentimes that doesn't mean prosecution or conviction. Oftentimes it's about the quality of our response. And I can't say enough about the number of times as a street officer, as an investigator, and now as an administrator, where people have talked about the poor experience perhaps that they had, and that ultimately becomes one of the important features of this, is that how do we improve that response? But importantly, how do we make sure that there isn't within the system blaming of cross-discipline? How do we ensure that by using the best of what each of us does, that we ultimately achieve those better outcomes? There is probably not a community out there that is involved in this work that can't cite a case where there was a failure that was systemic, that ultimately we didn't respond in the way that we might have, could have, or should have. And the disparate systems that existed, the siloing that existed, ultimately is what caused SARTs to become a reality. And I think my experience, and an opportunity for us to do better and achieve better outcomes. Buy-in is the involvement in teams and ongoing commitment to teams is something that the team has to be committed to. But I also think this is one of the leadership obligations, that whether that is at the executive or elected leadership level, or the management or administrative, there's been times when agencies have been less than active on the teams. You may have a number of different providers. You could have multiple advocacy programs that are serving a general area. You could have multiple law enforcement agencies. And you would find high levels of involvement by some and very little or no involvement by others. And frequently, I think this is one of the places where teams can come together and look at who has stronger relationships with those programs, with those organizations, those entities that are not as deeply involved, and then work at the administrative level, the elected level, and certainly at the operational level to find ways to forge deeper involvement. And I think it becomes key that we utilize those folks that are oftentimes the most vocal about the importance of the team. And there are champions in all of our organizations. And those champions become so important to help building and being willing to look at the value of the team and why it is that someone would want to more deeply engage. And I just think as a team we have to find the ways through the relationships that can exist to engage those people more deeply. And I think there's always ways to do that. Too often we think about it only at the operational level, the people that are the service provider level, but we need to think about the full range of ways in which we can encourage, even pressure, involvement for the good of the collective good of the work that we do and the outcomes for the victims. Well, I think one of the key reasons that disagreement can often occur really relates to the fact that there is sometimes misunderstandings. We bring new people into these groups on a somewhat regular basis. There can be different perceptions or beliefs about what the different disciplines provide and do. And that itself can be provide a source of some disagreement. In addition to that, I think these are really dynamic situations, and we are dealing with a whole lot of oftentimes emotions. Sometimes it can be matters of significant profile. And when those things happen, it rises the level of angst and anxiety that all the disciplines who wrap around these victims can feel. And so ultimately conflict is almost assured to occur. The key issue is really how do we manage that? Yeah, I think for me, there's been a variety of them over the years. Things around one case, one particular incident where early on in my experience with SARTs, the whole question of the role of advocacy relative to the investigator interview of a victim. And these were things that the team had not gotten to yet. And yet we'd started to forge these really strong relationships across discipline, but we had not gotten into the agreement around what that was going to look like. And in addition, sometimes the people that are sometimes doing the work directly, or all the people that are doing the work directly, are not involved in these conversations. And that can be a problem. You might have a command staff member or one or two investigators who serve or sit on the SART, but there are others who work these cases, and that's the place where disagreement can often occur. So in our particular case, we had a situation where there was a belief that the relationship was such and the agreement was such that advocates should sit in on that investigative interview. And for this particular investigator, was not aware or dialed into what that was going to be about at that time. Fortunately, when this incident kind of arose, there was relationships with the members of the investigative unit who sat on the SART, and ultimately they were able to kind of work through that agreement. And then ultimately it became clear that what was important was not just the relationships that existed among the people that sat in that monthly SART team meeting. It was important that we made sure that we were doing a much better job of communicating to our respective partners in and among our respective disciplines. That's how you better avoid these conflicts. But I think the opportunity here is really about how is it that we need to just recognize and know that these things are going to happen. We need to utilize the strength of the relationships that exist. And sometimes that may mean if there's a disagreement across different disciplines, for instance, law enforcement and advocacy might have a really strong relationship, but the SANE program might not be as strongly connected. Sometimes using the strength of these relationships to address the conflict that exists can really become useful. And that for us has been one of the key features of having a team, is that we utilize the strengths of the different disciplines that sit there. I think, one of the things, all of us who do this work recognize and know that our work is incredibly important. And we all have rules that govern the nature of how it is that we can communicate about these cases. And yet sometimes we end up sharing, we obviously share these cases. We wrap around, we come around these victims. And I think what can end up happening is that we need to recognize that there may be differences in rules that govern this. And at the same time, forge as a team ways in which we address those by just talking about what the various different requirements each of us has, and looking at in ways that we ultimately better engage the victim in making decisions about how this information can and might be shared. Because they oftentimes, if we're doing good victim-centered service across discipline, and the victims feel that sense of team wrapping around them, I think that's where the opportunity is to ultimately engage them in helping us forge better and stronger ways of addressing communication conflicts that can naturally occur. But we oftentimes, it's just a matter of creating deeper understandings, looking at sometimes particular instances or cases can present different challenges. And I think there is not one rule that's going to govern all these situations. But ultimately, it's sticking with it. It's engaging in that conversation over the long haul that ultimately results in resolution of these problems. As I think about, as I look at them more toward the end of my career, when I look back and think about all the things I was involved in, some of the outcomes that of working together with our partners, and even in cases where there wasn't a prosecution, but where our response ultimately brought or helped, aided in providing a sense of stability, some peace, some safety. To me, there are a few things I'm more proud of in my career, and that's why this is so important.